Shipped back for a scar no bonnet could hide, she rode west one final time. The day I stopped caring whether I lived or didn't, I was sitting on the edge of a water trough behind what used to be my livery stable, watching the sun come up over a town that had already decided it was done with me. That's where she found me. Not riding in on something grand. Not announced. Just a woman on a blue roan mare coming down the alley between the feed store and the old Assier's building, the kind of alley people used when they didn't want to be seen on the main street. She had a canvas bag tied to the saddle and a hat pulled low, and she rode like somebody who'd done a lot of riding without anybody waiting at the other end of it. I didn't know her. I want to be clear about that. I didn't know her, and she didn't know me, and what happened between us wasn't the kind of thing either of us was looking for. It was the kind of thing that found you when you'd stopped looking, when you'd stopped pretty much everything. My name is Cal Rourke. I'll be 63 years old next month if I make it that far, which on the morning she rode down that alley I was not particularly planning to do. Not by any dramatic means. I just meant I'd been running on empty for close to 2 years, and the empty was getting louder, and I didn't see a reason to keep topping it off. The livery had been my father's, and then mine for 26 years. Lost it in a judgment I won't go into at length except to say the man who took it had a cousin on the bench, and that's all there is to say about the law in Cutter's Bend, New Mexico Territory, in the year of our Lord 1887. After the judgment, I took to sleeping in the tack room I'd been renting back from the new owner for $2 a week, which he raised to $3 after I'd been there a month, knowing I had nowhere else. My wife Clara had been dead 4 years. My son Davis was up in Colorado somewhere, working mines, and we hadn't spoken in 2. The silence between us wasn't clean. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it, that you carry around in your chest like a stone that never quite dissolves. I had $17 and some change to my name. My hands still worked. I could shoe a horse as well as any man in the territory always could, but the new owner of the livery, a man named Dortch, had brought his own man in from Albuquerque to do the work, so I was left doing odd jobs around town, mending fences, hauling load. The kind of work a man does when nobody wants what he's actually good at. I was sitting on that trough with a cold cup of coffee, and an idea slowly forming in my head that maybe I'd just ride out into the desert and not come back, when she turned down the alley. She pulled up about 10 feet from me. She looked at me from under that hat brim, and I could see, even from where I sat, that she had a scar. Started somewhere around her left eye, swept down across the cheek, not thin, the kind of scar you got from something that didn't give you time to get out of the way. She wasn't hiding it exactly. She just wasn't presenting it. It was there the same way her nose was there, the same way her hands on the reins were there. She said, "You the one they call Rourke?" I said I was. She said, "Someone in the saloon told me you used to run this livery." "Still run it in my head," I said. "Man named Dortch runs it in actual fact." She looked at the trough I was sitting on, looked at the cup in my hand. She said, "That coffee any good?" "No," I said. She swung down from the roan without invitation, tied the reins to the post beside the trough, and sat down on the other end of it. Not beside me, far enough away to be decent, close enough to talk without raising her voice. She said her name was Vera Marsh. She'd come up from Las Cruces. Before that, from somewhere back east I didn't ask about yet. She was looking to buy a small place. Not a ranch, she said. Not working land. Just a few acres with good water and something standing on it, something she could fix into livable. She had money enough for that, she said, if I knew of any such thing in the area. "Why ask me?" I said. "I'm a broke man sitting behind a livery I don't own anymore." "Because," she said, "the man in the saloon told me you knew every piece of land within 30 miles of this town and who owned it and what it was worth and what they'd take for it." He wasn't wrong. 26 years of shoeing horses for every rancher and settler in the area, you hear things. You remember things. It's not something I ever thought of as useful because nobody had ever needed it from me before. It was just how my head worked. There's a place, I said before I'd fully decided to say it. Decker spread, southeast about 8 miles. Old couple. Decker died last spring. His wife Mabel's been trying to hold it alone. She won't last the winter, not honestly. About 120 acres, creek runs through the north end of it, small cabin and a barn that's seen better years. She'd sell. She looked at me steadily. You know her. Shot her husband's horses for 15 years. Would she talk to me? She'd talk to anybody who came with a fair offer and didn't waste her time. Vera Marsh was quiet a moment. She looked at the livery building, then at her horse, then at nothing in particular. I had the feeling she was used to making decisions the way I was used to shoeing horses methodically and without asking for anyone's approval. She said, "Would you take me out there?" I looked at her. She said, "I'll pay you for your time. A day's wage, whatever that means to you." What it meant to me was about $1.50. I didn't say that. I said, "I've got a horse," which I did, a hammer-headed gray I'd been keeping paid up at the far end of the livery, the one thing I hadn't lost because Dortch hadn't wanted him. We rode out the next morning. I won't say it was easy company right away. It wasn't. She didn't talk much and I didn't have much to say that wasn't grim, and 8 miles across flats in November is 8 miles across flats in November no matter who you're riding with. Cold and pale and the grass all turned, and the sky a flat white. The kind of day that doesn't offer you anything. But somewhere around the 4th mile she said, "That gray's got a hitch in his left front." I said, "I know. I've been working it out. Bad trim from 2 owners ago, the hoof wall grew wrong. Takes time." She said, "You fixed it yourself." "Doing it myself, yeah." She looked at the gray's gait the way a person looks who actually knows what they're seeing. She said, "You're doing it right. Patience trim. Most men would have used a wedge pad." I glanced at her. "You know horses." "My father was a farrier," she said. "Before everything else he was a farrier." I didn't ask what everything else was. Not yet. Mabel Decker was a small, dry woman in her late 60s who met us at the cabin door with a look that said she'd been expecting somebody, just not us specifically. She shook Vera Marsh's hand and looked at the scar the way a decent woman does directly once, and then not again. We sat at her table and drank real coffee, and she talked about the place the way a woman talks about a thing she has loved, and is not too proud to admit she can no longer keep. The creek, she said, ran good even in dry years. The soil in the south pasture was deep. The barn needed the south wall rebuilt and the roof had 2 weak spots she'd been dealing with by moving buckets. The cabin was small, she said. 1 room and a lean-to kitchen, but solid. Her husband had built it to last, and he'd been a man who knew what that meant. Vera listened without interrupting. She asked 3 questions, all of them specific, none of them about price. When Mabel was done, Vera said she'd like to walk the creek line before making any offer, and Mabel said go ahead, she'd be here. We walked the creek. The willows along it were bare. The water ran clear and cold and faster than you'd expect, coming out of a limestone shelf about a 1/4 mile north of the barn. I stood on the bank and watched it and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was that something in this world was still running the way it was supposed to run. Vera said, "What would you offer her?" I said, "That's not my business." "I'm asking," she said. I thought about it. I said, $600, maybe $650 if she pushes. The land's worth more, but she needs to move this winter and both of you know it. You offer low and she'll think you're taking advantage of a widow. You offer right and she'll think you're decent. 600, Vera said, not a question. 600, I said. She offered Mabel Decker $600 cash that afternoon. Mabel took it without haggling. They shook hands at the table with me sitting there drinking a second cup of coffee I hadn't asked for, and I felt like a man who just watched something real happen and been allowed to be in the room for it. On the ride back, Vera said, "I'll need help with the barn." I said, "I know a few men who work cheap." She said, "I don't need men who work cheap. I need one man who knows what he's doing." I didn't say anything. She said, "You know what you're doing, Cal Rourke." It was the first time she'd used my given name. The light was going thin, and the cold was settling in, and I was looking at the ears of my gray horse, and I didn't say anything for maybe 30 seconds. Then I said, "The barn's going to take 2-3 weeks of good work." "I know that," she said. "I'd want to bring the south wall down and start from the footer." "That's the right way," she said. "And the roof wants new decking on the east slope before you do any tin." "I know it does," she said. So that was how it started. I won't dress it up into something it wasn't. The first week I rode out every morning from my tack room in Cutter's Bend, and I worked on that barn and she worked beside me, not handing me things, not watching, working, and I rode back every evening. She fed me dinner both times I stayed past dark, and the food was plain and good, and she didn't ask me to be grateful for it. The scar, I came to see, ran from just below her left eye to the line of her jaw. An old one, years, not months. She didn't cover it. She'd stopped covering it somewhere along the way, you could tell, the way she'd long since stopped waiting for someone to flinch. The story, when it came in pieces over the 2 weeks we worked together. Not a confession. More like a man finding a rusted piece of equipment in a field, a piece at a time, turning each piece over. She'd been married back east, Ohio. Her husband was a man who thought he owned what he touched, and what he touched included her. The scar was his. Not all at once, the way those men work, it's never all at once. It's slow and it's steady, and by the time you understand what's happening, you've already lost a good deal of yourself. She'd left after the scar. She'd waited until he was away for 3 days, and she'd taken the horse she'd bought with her own money, and the money she'd been putting back in a flour tin for over a year, and she'd left. Her family had sent her back. That part she said flat, no extra words around it. Her family had sent her back because a woman who left her husband was a worse problem than whatever she'd left. She said the word, family, the way you say the name of a thing that used to mean something and now is just a sound. She'd gone back for 8 months. Then she'd left again, and this time she hadn't told anyone she was going, and she hadn't gone east, she'd gone west, and she'd kept going west until east was far enough away that it couldn't follow. Las Cruces had been 2 years, now here. She told me this while we were pulling the rotted planks off the south wall of the barn, both of us working pry bars on either end of a long board, and she told it the way somebody tells a thing that happened, past tense, accounted for, not asking for anything from the telling. She wasn't looking for my reaction. She was just telling it because we'd been working close together for enough days that not telling it would have been its own kind of thing. I said, "You rode out alone both times." "Yes," she said. "The second time, knowing your family wouldn't help." "Yes." I thought about that, about what it costs to do that. I'd been counting up all my own losses for 2 years like they were the worst thing that had happened to anybody. And here was a woman who'd ridden west twice on nerve alone, and bought herself a creek and a leaky barn, and was pulling rotten boards off a wall in the cold November air without a flinch of self-pity anywhere in her. I didn't say that. I just pulled my end of the board and we got it loose and walked it out to the pile. Somewhere in the second week I told her about Clara. Not the whole of it at once, same way she'd told me. But the shape of it, how Clara had been sick for 2 years before she died, how I'd known it was coming and thought I was ready, and how ready turns out to be a word that doesn't mean much when the thing actually happens. How after her there was just the livery, and then there wasn't even that. Vera listened the way she did most things, straight on, no sound. When I was done, she said, "Were you happy before the losing started?" It was such a plain question. I had to think about it like I hadn't thought about anything in a long time. I said, yeah, I was. Not in any big way, in the small ways, in the everyday ways. She nodded once, like that answered something she'd needed answered. The day we finished the south wall, good pine planks, proper footer work, nothing that was going to shift on her. She came out from the cabin with 2 mugs of coffee, and she stood next to me, and we both looked at what we'd done, and the mugs were warm in our hands, and the cold was clean that day, not mean. And I thought about how long it had been since I'd stood somewhere and looked at something I'd built and felt like it was worth standing at. I said, roof next week. She said yes. The roof took another week and a half. We got the decking down on the east slope and the new tin on before the first real snow. The morning we finished, the snow came while we were still up on the roof, and we sat there on the ridge for a minute watching it start, and she laughed, not a big laugh, just a quiet one, and said it figured. I don't know exactly when I started noticing things. Maybe I always noticed them and just didn't let myself think about what I was noticing. The way she moved around her place like she'd been there 20 years and not 20 days. The way she talked to the blue roan in the morning, low and easy, nothing baby talk about it, just a woman talking to a horse she'd had a long time. The way she could work all day and not complain about anything. Not the cold, not the work, not the situation she was in. And the not complaining wasn't hard-bitten silence. It was just that she was actually all right, actually present in what she was doing. The way she looked at me when I said something that was true. That's the one I kept coming back to. She had a look she gave you when you said something real, nothing dramatic, just a kind of settling in her face, like she'd been waiting for something honest and was glad it had finally arrived. I'd been a long time not being looked at that way. It was the last day of the roof work. We were down off it, tools put away, the barn genuinely finished, and I was getting my gray ready to head back to town. She came out of the cabin with a small envelope, my week's pay, and she held it out, and I took it and put it in my coat pocket, and then I didn't move because I didn't have anywhere I was in a hurry to get to, which had been true for 2 years but felt different standing there. She said, there's still the cabin to think about. I said, Linta roof could use new shakes, chinking on the north walls gone thin. That's what I thought, she said. I looked at the gray's ear. I could come back Monday, I said. Monday's fine, she said. I rode back to town. I ate dinner at the boarding house. I sat in the tack room with my $17, no more than that now, closer to 40 with what I'd made. And I lay on my cot and looked at the ceiling, and I thought about the way she'd laughed on the roof when the snow started. I was back Monday. I worked the cabin through most of December. The chinking, the shakes, a new shelf system in the Linta kitchen she'd been wanting, a door on the storage room that actually hung right. Small work, close work, the kind you do indoors when the cold gets serious. We ate lunch together most days. She cooked some days, I cooked some days. I am not a man who talks about himself as a cook, but I can do a reasonable camp stew, and she didn't complain about it. One evening in the 3rd week of December I stayed past dark, not by plan. It was just that the shelf work had gone long and we were almost done, and you don't quit when you're almost done. And after dinner, we sat by her stove and she read and I looked at nothing, and the fire crackled and outside it was snowing again, and it was the most at peace I had felt in a long time. Since before Clara died. Maybe since before she got sick. Vera looked up from her book. She watched me a moment. She said, you look different than you did. I said, different how? When I rode down that alley, she said. You looked like a man who'd made up his mind about something. I was quiet. What had you made up your mind about? She said. I thought about lying. I was never a man who lied much, and I was too old to start. I said, nothing good. She didn't push on it. She just looked at me steady. Then she said, I'm glad I needed somebody who knew the land. Her voice was plain, no drama in it. She meant what she said, and she said it like she meant it, the way she did everything. I said, I'm glad you asked. And that was all that was said about it. But something settled in the room. Something that had been standing between us sat down. Christmas came and went. I don't make much of Christmas. She didn't either. We ate a decent meal, and she'd gotten a bottle of rye from somewhere, and we had a glass of it after, and she gave me a good pair of work gloves she'd had made in town, and I gave her a horse brush I'd fitted with a new handle, proper handle, shaped right, not the usual thin grip, and she looked at it for a long moment and said, "This is a good thing, Cal." That was all. A good thing. It was enough. I was not sleeping in the tack room any more by then. I want to be straightforward about that. I'd taken a room at the boarding house, paid up through January with the work money, and there was nothing between Vera and me that wasn't decent. But I'd stopped going back to that tack room, and I want to say it was partly her fault and partly my own, but if I'm honest, it was mostly her. She'd done what she set out to do, which was her place, her work, her life on her own terms. And being around someone who was actually living that way, who hadn't given up on any of it, who got up every morning and did what needed doing without asking the world to apologize first, it got into me. The idea that I could do that I hadn't used all of that up. January was cold, hard cold, the plains kind, where the wind comes at you from 3 directions at once and you can feel it through 2 coats. I came out to her place 3 times a week to do the remaining work. There was still the lean-to kitchen addition she'd planned, and the fence line on the north side of the property needed attention. Honest work. Work I knew how to do. One afternoon near the end of January, I was repairing the fence line, and I heard her coming on the roan before I saw her. The mare had a particular way of moving on packed snow, a sound I knew by then, and she pulled up and sat there with a paper in her hand. She held it out. It was a letter from her husband. He'd found her, not in person, not yet. The letter had come to the Las Cruces address she'd had, forwarded by a neighbor. He knew she was in New Mexico. He knew she'd bought land. He'd written it the way those men write, all reasonableness on the surface, all pressure underneath, asking her to come home, using the word home like it meant what it used to mean. I read it twice. I folded it and held it out to her, and she took it and put it back in her coat. I said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want to not be afraid of a piece of paper." Her voice was even. I said, "He know where exactly?" "No, just the territory." I thought. I said, "He come out here, he's in my territory." I said it quiet, the way you say a fact. She looked at me then, looked at me the way she looked at things she wanted to understand fully. Then she said, "I'm not going back, Cal." "I know you're not," I said. "I need you to know that I can handle this myself." "I know that too," I said. "You rode west twice on your own. I know what you can handle." She was quiet. The wind moved her coat. She said, "But I don't want to." I looked at her. She said, "Handle it alone. I've been alone long enough." Her voice didn't waver. It was the plainest thing she'd said to me yet. I rode west this last time with one final idea in my head, which was that I was going to build something that was mine and stay in it. And I've done that. And now I find I don't want to be in it alone. The cold was serious. My hands in the good gloves she'd had made were still cold. The roan mare stood quiet behind her. I said, "I was sitting on a water trough the morning you came down that alley, Vera. You know what I was thinking about doing." "I know," she said, quiet. "You pulled me off that." "You pulled yourself off it," she said. "I just needed somebody who knew the land." That's when she got down from the roan. She walked up to me and she put her hand on my arm, and it was the first time she'd touched me in any way that wasn't in passing, and even through the coat I felt the weight of her hand, and it was solid and deliberate, and she said, "I see you, Cal Rourke. I know what you are. I don't want you to be anywhere else." I didn't say anything. I couldn't right then. I put my hand over hers on my arm, and we stood there in the January cold on her fence line with the snow and the wind and the bare fence posts waiting, and I thought, 62 years old, and you can still be surprised by what is left in the world. The letter came to nothing. Her husband wrote 2 more times and then stopped. Whether he lost the nerve or the interest, I don't know and don't care. He never came west. Maybe he knew something about the math of that situation, which was that he'd be riding into a county where I'd shod horses for 26 years and knew every man who mattered, and she had a neighbor in Mabel Decker who had 2 grown sons and could read a rifle as well as either of them. Some men can read a situation when they choose to look at it honestly. February, I moved out of the boarding house. I want to be clear. Mabel Decker's oldest boy rode out and married us in her kitchen. That was Vera's idea, not mine, though I had no objection. A man and woman living on the same property in a territory this size, even in 1887, could do it decently or not, and Vera Marsh had done enough things the hard way. She wanted to do this one right, and what she wanted was good enough for me. The service was 12 minutes and involved 2 witnesses who were both Mabel's sons, and a Bible that had belonged to Mabel's husband, and a ring I'd had made in Cutter's Bend from a piece of silver I'd kept from a commission job years back. It was a plain ring and it fit, and she looked at it on her hand the way she'd looked at the horse brush, quiet, for a long moment, saying it was a good thing. That was 6 months ago. The lean-to kitchen's done, the fence is right, the barn's solid enough to pass to whoever comes after us. The roan and the gray share the south paddock and have arrived at something like tolerance. I got a letter from my son Davis in June, a short one, stiff, but a letter. Vera said right back, so I did. Another letter came last month, less stiff. These things take time. I'm not going to make it into something grand. It isn't grand. It's 120 acres of creek land and a solid cabin and a woman who knows horses and doesn't waste words and gets up before the sun without complaint. It's work I know how to do. It's being needed for what I actually am. 62 years old, I'd come to think that the account was settled and I knew what it added up to. I'd run a livery, I'd had a good wife, I'd built what I built. I thought the arithmetic was done. I was sitting on a water trough counting myself out. And she rode down that alley. There's a specific thing she does in the evening when the light's going down, and she's come in from whatever she's been at, and she gets herself a cup of coffee, and she leans against the door of the lean-to kitchen and looks out across the south pasture toward where the creek willows are. She doesn't say anything. She's just looking at her land. The light's on her face and the scars there, and she's not hiding anything and not performing anything, and she's just a woman standing in her own doorway looking at her own piece of the world. I come in from the barn and I see her standing there, and she turns and she looks at me and she nods once, the way she does, and goes back to looking at the pasture. That's the whole of it. There's no better way to say it than that.